Ziad, thank you so much for participating in Anti-Racism Live.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for doing this and doing the important work that you do.
Okay, the first question I'd like to ask you, Ziad, is could you tell us about your work and mission and why 21 March, the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, is so important to you?
Long story short, I was very privileged to grow up in Princeton, New Jersey, as an American Muslim, as a person of color, as a Bangladeshi American, where I very quickly became aware of how often in my hallways and hallways around this country and around this world, students are otherized because of who society thinks they should be. And that didn't sit right with me. And so when I was in sort of at the end of 8th grade, I decided to start a nonprofit around social justice advocacy and creating a platform by which teens could organize around identity, around stereotypes, around advocating for a better world for all of us. And sort of through that work, I found myself in rooms that I didn't know existed, with industry leaders, with decision makers, with politicians, where I realized how often young people were being spoken about but not spoken to. And so I started a company by which we could empower more diverse young people with a seat at the table at the most important decision-making tables of our time. And so much of my work has been about this notion that I believe the world looks better when diverse young people have seats at the table, and I believe the world looks better when we trust those who are closest to the reality as the expert on that reality. And I think so much of what is wrong in the world right now is this notion that because I don't see it, it doesn't exist. To the contrary, I think because you don't see it means it exists, means that the person for whom it exists is not at the table. And I think this day is so important. This notion of organizing around anti-racism is so vital because we still live in a world where so many are otherized, are targeted, are attacked because of the color of their skin, because of who society thinks they should be. And I am every day, more committed, right, to working towards a world where every kid can grow up to feel safe, loved, and accepted. And that has always been what has really kept me grounded in my why, right? Is this notion that I think that every kid deserves to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel accepted. But the only way that we guarantee that notion for all of our kids, I don't have kids yet, but one day, inshallah, maybe. But I aspire for a world where all of our kids are safe, loved, and accepted. And the only way that I think we can really achieve that world is if we advocate for the right of every child to feel safe, loved, and accepted. And so I think that this day is so important such that we can have conversations about what does it mean to get to that world? What does it mean to get to a world where every person has the agency to dream and the agency to actualize those dreams? Because I think we can all use more dreaming and more doing.
Sia, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. So the 21st of March, the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Anti-Racism Day. I mean, where do you feel the global community is in relation to eradicating racism?
I always struggle when I think sometimes as a public speaker, you want to be optimistic. I don't know that on that question I feel so optimistic, insofar as I am really concerned about where we are in terms of misinformation, in terms of hate speech, in terms of so much vitriol on the internet projected largely against women and people of color and queer communities and already vulnerable and marginalized communities. And I'm really concerned at a culture that has normalized such toxic behavior and such incredible violence against vulnerable communities. I'm also really concerned at a world that looks at loss of life with such callousness, especially when that loss of life is in and around communities of color, and how the global community and global media responds to loss of life differently, depending on the pigment of skin of victims, is something that keeps me up at night. And so I am horrified every day at the racism, at the callousness, at the double standards that exist in global rhetoric as it pertains to lives of color. And I'm angry, but I am also equal parts hopeful insofar as I find myself inspired every day by diverse young people who are fighting the good fight, right? Who are shaking people and waking them up and making them confront the double standards of our time and making people confront the humanity that exists within each of us. And I think that our generation, Gen Z writ large, is a more inclusive, is a more progressive, is a more anti-racist generation that is looking in the mirror and asking more of us to confront our own privileges, our own biases, and creating more intersectional communities that understand that all of our justices, all of our human rights are linked to each other. And that the only way that we can guarantee a better world is by fighting for all of us. And by fighting against all the systems of inequity and injustice, whether that be climate action or whether that be anti-racism work, or whether that be to work towards a world with more socioeconomic equality. And so I think that all of these issues are intertwined, and I think that our generation is understanding that more than ever. And really, I think the beauty of youth has always been that a young person can look at the world and say, just because things have been this way does not mean they have to stay this way. And the beauty of youth is to reimagine the status quo and to disrupt it. And I think Gen Z is certainly doing that, looking at this world and being really angry at the racism, the callousness, the injustice that exists, and saying this can't be the best that we can do, and actively reimagining new anti-racist, new inclusive intersectional ecosystems and institutions that ultimately serve more of us. And it is a hard and steep road perhaps ahead and arduous, but I fully believe when you follow the lead of young, diverse voices, particularly Black and brown women, and queer folks, I think that there is a certainly light at the end of that tunnel and at the end of that road that I think that we all ought to be working towards, and I think that is always going to be worthwhile.
Incredible, amazing to listen to, so inspiring. Thank you, Ziad. So Ziad, we're seeing an increase in racism, hatred, and divide in communities as a consequence of the global crisis that we're facing. What's your assessment of the situation, and can we turn it around?
There's so much to be said on this question. And I have been, I think, sadder these last 6 months than maybe I've ever been in my life. Insofar as, I think, reckoning with the callousness, right, with the moral bankruptcy of leaders has been harrowing. Even when already in theory and in concept knowing that such insidious leadership exists, I think having to confront it day in and day out the last 6 months has been really challenging. And I think living in an era of such crisis, of such misinformation, of such violence, of such hatred, has bred a ton of fear and anger and resentment and a ton of nihilism. I think a lot of people feel right now, how much louder can we shout before they hear us? And I think there are a lot of good reasons to be shouting right now. I am really concerned though, and I'm really concerned though while I am fully on board to shout and believe that we ought to be shouting right now, that we also ought to be conversing, right? That I think that in order to make the progress that we need to see in the world, communities that don't always agree with each other need to sit at tables together and need, to the point I made earlier, to reckon with the humanity of each other. Need to reckon with the idea that every child deserves to live in safety, to live with dignity, to live with honor, to live with joy. And that no child should pay for their crimes of their morally bankrupt leaders. And no child should be hungry, should be hurting because of the pigment of their skin or because of anything. And no child's life should be treated as collateral damage, as collective punishment. And I resent a world that allows for any child's life to be treated as expendable, that allows any life to be treated as expendable. And I think until we live in a world where every person feels that no matter where someone comes from or what someone looks like or how someone loves, that their life deserves as much respect and reverence as our own, that we will not get to where we need to go. And so I think that requires having friends, having partners, having relationships with people outside of our own communities, outside of our own silos, such that we reckon with the humanity of each other, such that we work towards a world that guarantees the safety of each other, that guarantees the humanity and dignity of each other. And I think that isn't happening enough. I think that right now the world glosses over loss of life in countries and regions and communities, because I think the world still sees certain communities as more deserving of that violence. And that is such a disgusting reality. No community is more deserving of violence, should have to be more prepared for violence, should be more prepared for racism, should have to be more prepared for injustice. Every kid deserves the same shot to be joyful, to be successful, to be alive. And I am so angry at a world that doesn't live with that truth in mind. But I'm so grateful for days like today that remind us that the only way forward is one that guarantees that for every child and for every human, and that requires anti-racist practice, and that requires following the lead of activists and organizers who have always been on the right side of history and who have always spoken truth to power and who have always led us towards better.
Ziad, incredible. I mean, thank you for sharing your thoughts, and it's amazing to listen to you, and it gives me great hope, and I feel inspired by hearing your thoughts today. So I want to ask you, Ziad, in relation to eliminating racial discrimination, let's talk about where you draw your hope from. I mean, do you think it's actually possible that humans could live together side by side, irrespective of the color of their skin, political views, or religious beliefs? I mean, that's a question, but also, where's your hope come from?
I don't know that I agree that that's a question. It can't be. I refuse to accept a world where that cannot be a reality. And I think that we allow ourselves to succumb to a defeatist mindset when we allow it to become a question. I think it is like entertaining the question, am I enough? When you start entertaining a thought process like that, you find yourself in a never-ending cycle of defeatism. And the consequence of falling victim to defeatism on this question is far too great. We have to believe that we can live in a world where every person can live side by side, maybe not in harmony, but at least in safety. I do not think that we'll ever live in a utopia where every person agrees with each other on every issue, and I don't think that we should. I think disagreement is good. I think difference of opinion is healthy. I do not think that a world where anyone is made to feel unsafe because of who they are is a world that any of us should ever believe is intrinsic to the human condition. I think that the role of leadership, the role of innovation, the role of politics is to work towards a world where all of our rights and humanity and safety are guaranteed. I'm not saying it is easy. I think that there are so many systems of injustice and pervasive and perverse complexes that exist both structurally and sociologically that we have to deconstruct and undo and critically analyze in order to get to that world. But it has to be possible. I do not think that I have all the answers in terms of how we get there. But I do think so much of it has to start with looking in the mirror. Insofar as I think so much of what is wrong is oftentimes, it is easy to zoom out and look at society and say, this is wrong. And it is much harder and more uncomfortable to say, but this is what I've internalized from those wrong ecosystems and psychologies and complexes, and how am I going to live with the politic and ethic that I want the world to emulate? I think especially that is incumbent upon me as a person of privilege. But I think writ large, we all have to be willing to have really uncomfortable conversations with self and other in regards to how are we perpetuating norms? How are you perpetuating language? How are you perpetuating behaviors that ultimately create a world that is not safe for all? And to the point that we just made about, the current climate that we're living in, vocabulary matters a lot. When we view some victims as dead and some victims as murdered, that says a lot about how we value their humanity. That says a lot about whose lives we value and why. And so the news that we consume, the words that we use, the politicians that we vote for, the decisions that we make in terms of how we treat people, the jobs that we do, these all have an impact on the world. And often a fraught, complicated, juxtaposed, contradictory impact. And I think that it is sometimes deeply uncomfortable to sit with those tensions, but is necessary in order for us to get towards a world where more of us are safe, where more of us are celebrated and included. And I think that's important, but I think that there is no substitute for real legislative change. And I expect so much more of the leaders, whether that be in government or in business or otherwise, who I think are not being imaginative enough and are not reckoning with the gravity of this moment enough insofar as the action that we need when so many are still so unsafe and treated so unfairly, and when so much inequity still exists, whether in regards to safety, whether in regards to wealth, whether in regards to basic human rights. And so we need legislative action, we need sociological action, and we need better leaders who look like the world that we live in. And fundamentally, so much strife exists because the world is not governed by the many. The boardrooms and halls of Congress do not look like the world that we live in, do not represent the interests, do not represent the experiences of so many vulnerable, marginalized communities, and that needs to change. The world looks better when our leadership looks like us, looks like the world that we live in, reflects the obstacles that we are facing, and actually gives a damn about surmounting and overcoming those obstacles because they get it, because they're in it. And right now we have a lot of global leadership that is rooted in savior complex instead of rooted in community. And we have to have leadership and governance that looks like community-oriented governance and leadership that understands the needs of the community because they are of the community, and that is deeply interested in the welfare of communities because they are part of those communities, because they understand them, because they're in and amongst them. And that isn't happening enough right now. And so I think so much strife and incongruent leadership is happening subsequently. And I think that there is real penalty and moral hazard to that. And so I think that there are many levels of what I aspire for, but I think we have to believe that it can get better. And we have to be imaginative enough to reimagine what new systems, what new leadership, what new personal practice can look like to help us get there.
Ziad, thank you. Thank you for that. Let me ask you just a little bit before I move on to the final question of how we can, support people to engage. I just want to ask about hope. I mean, where do you draw your hope from? Your passion and understanding and wisdom, and experiences that you've had clearly that allow you to talk in the way that you have, the gift that you have, and how wonderful that you and many others, have this, right? This passion to support humanity's survival. I just want to ask you about hope. I just want to ask you about where did it come from?
For me, it's not about hope. It's about necessity. Like, I don't know that I feel so hopeful, but I feel that this is urgent and that this is necessary, right? I think survival is a human instinct, and I have been privileged enough to not necessarily be in a mindset of survival my whole life, but I am close enough to folks and communities who I think have, where I understand that there is no choice other than to give a damn, other than to try, other than to try to advocate for better. And even then, I don't know that I do enough most days. My life is full of contradiction, and I try, and sometimes that feels enough and sometimes it doesn't, but I don't know that I feel so hopeful, but I know that I feel so passionate that we have to be so much better than we are today. I am only hopeful insofar as I believe it to be a legitimate form of resistance, insofar as when we succumb to a mindset of defeatism, we have allowed the status quo to win. And I will never allow the status quo to govern my imagination. I think I have to believe that the world can be better than it is today. And I choose to believe that I can be some teeny small part of that change. I have to. Otherwise, why is my life worth living? And I believe we can have different theories of change. And so I find hope in the fact that more rooms in my world, in my ecosystems, I am getting to bring more diverse young people into those boardrooms and into those conversations. And they inspire me because they take those seats and they use them. And they advocate for their communities, and they advocate for their interests, and they advocate for their experiences and stories. And they make the leaders in power reimagine their world perspective. And that to me is impactful. And so I find hope in the fact that young leaders from different communities are being convened, and I have a role to play in convening those communities, and our voices are being heard more and more than ever. And so that gives me hope. But why any of this started wasn't about hope, it was about necessity. It was about the fact that I found myself at rooms and I was the only young person, or I was the only Muslim, or I was the only person of color, and I was like, this cannot be the best that we can do. And so I pulled more of my peers in with me, most of whom come from different communities and backgrounds than I do. And I said more of us need to be at these tables. And now we're living in a moment where more of us are at those tables, but still not enough of us. And so I don't want to sit here and pretend that I feel optimistic. I am angry and I'm sad most days. But I am encouraged in moments that more of us are being heard and more of us have latitude to speak our truth to power. And I am hopeful that those in power choose to listen to said truth, to make better and more human decisions that protect more of us. But right now at present, I don't have so much reason to believe that they are listening, but I'll be damned if I stop trying.
Amazing. Incredible. I want to ask you, to the person feeling, I totally understand what you're saying about necessity. It all makes complete sense. And of course, I, like you, get up every day and just want to do the very best I can. And when I feel down and when it gets dark is when it gets interesting. And that's really when you need to search for the light and just never give up. I mean, I'm so into what you're saying. It's wonderful to hear you talk. But I want to ask you, to the person feeling disempowered, because sometimes it exists out there. You and I know there are people who are feeling disempowered by what they're receiving, how they might be living, certain people they're living with, whatever the circumstances they're in. They're feeling disempowered. They feel unequipped to be part of the elimination of racial discrimination. I want to ask you, what resources or organizations would you recommend they go to be informed, inspired, and engaged?
A long list. The people who come to mind first will always be my best friends. Chelsea Miller, Nupal Kiazolu, Bria Baker. They are Chelsea Miller's organization, Freedom March NYC, strongly encourage folks to look into. Leah Thomas, intersectional environmentalist, I strongly encourage folks to look into. There are so many young, dynamic voices of color who are leading the way and who have always been leading the way forward. And I am so grateful every day to be in community with them. Khalil Green, who does amazing work in chronicling the story, the history, right? He's the Gen Z historian of injustice and racism in America and globally in terms of how he arrived to this moment. There's so many resources, digitally and otherwise, insofar as people who are educating and galvanizing and organizing towards better. So those are some people that I'd maybe start with, but there are oh so many, and that gives me hope that there are more and more each day of folks who are leading and are picking up a microphone and speaking their truth and getting noticed for it and changing people's minds along the way. And I think that is so critical and so inspirational. And I have learned so much from those people that I just mentioned. And there are so many others. But I'd start there. and I would keep clicking on who they're tagging and who they're interacting with to learn even more from all of our communities and from all of our vantage points. But I think my TLDR is always, when we center and listen to the voices of diverse young people, the world always looks a little bit brighter and better.
Ziad, can I just ask, people who want to find out more information about the organization that you founded, where can we go?
Don't worry about me. Follow Chelsea, follow Nupal, follow Khalil, follow Leah. They have a lot. Follow Bria. They have a lot more to teach than me.
Amazing. Well, I will tell the audience where to find information about you. But thank you so much. Honestly, it's I've got tears in my eyes. It's incredible to listen to you. I feel very honored to have had 25 minutes. I do, and that's how it is. But thank you for everything. I wish you the very best.
Thank you for all that you do. It is important, and it is necessary, and it is inspiring, and I am grateful to be in community with you and to live in a world where folks like you and I can spend our privilege to advocate for better for more of us, and hoping that we can do so responsibly is all that any of us can hope for. And it seems to me that you are doing so beautifully and responsibly and intentionally, and I am grateful to be in community with you and to learn from you and to hopefully be part of this global movement of folks who are invested in the eradication of global racism. And I think that behooves each of us to play some role in it. And I'm not equipped to give anyone advice, but I am equipped to offer my admiration for you and the work that you do. And just hoping that I can follow in your footsteps and that we can hopefully make the world at least marginally better than it is today, because I think we can all agree at least on one thing, that it needs to be.
Agreed. Well, I look forward to meeting you again on the journey. Good luck with everything, and thank you for today.
Likewise. Thank you so much.